All right, I will say good morning. Good morning. Let us begin. Baruch Hashem, a beautiful week of Maseches Gittin ahead of us. I thank you to Rabbi Akiva for giving shir on Shabbos, to Rabbi Yomi Malevsky for giving shir on Sunday, and Amir Hashem, it is a great schus to be back with everyone today. So our shir is dedicated today by our TALMUD Torah sponsors for the month of Menachem Av Benjamin and Elys Wohl from the Tanya Eretz Yisrael for dedicating all the Shir and Drashos this month in honor of Moishe, Abramson, and Jeremy Lasson for making the shiurim available to all of those beyond the confines of our physical Bais Midrash. Mr. Jack Bennett in memory of Sergeant Nicholai, Rappaport of the Givati Brigade, who died in a Hezbullah ambush in southern Lebanon on February 7th, 1998. And our week of learning sponsors Nathan and Beth Adler in memory of Ben Adler, Zichron Lebracha, HaChaver Baruch Mordechai ben Morenu Rav Nosson, on the occasion of his first yahrzeit, on the 23rd of Av. We hope that in the merit of our TALMUD Torah, all of the Neshama Slav and Aliyah and the families in HaChaver. So with that, let us begin. Today's daf is Pei Gimel, 83. And we are picking up Amir Hashem on Pei Gimel at the two dots, 9 lines down, right? 2, 4, 6, 8. Yeah, last word on the 8th line, well, effectively 9 lines down. We also dedicate our learning in the Schusar Refuah for Zechariah Dov Ben Perel Shira. We hope this little boy has a tremendous refuah together with Kol Cholei Yisrael. And I want to give a special welcome back, a Baruch Haba, to Dr. Ron Gartenhaus, who is joining us on Zoom this morning. Baruch Hashem, Baruch Rofei Cholim, continued refuah, gesund, and hatzlacha me'er ve'esrim shanim tovos. So with that, let us begin. A lot to do today. Tan Rabbanon, la'achar petiras al Rabbi Elazar. After Rabbi Elazar passed away, so remember again, we had the great schos on yesterday, to begin the new parak, and the Mishnah recorded the position of, Rabbi Eliezer. So remember again, all centered on one core case. A man divorces his wife, and he says to his wife, Hariat mutaras l'chol adam ela leploni. You are divorced, you are permitted to every man except for Ploni, except for a certain individual. Rabbi Eliezer paskin that halacha l'maisa, ultimately again, it's a good gerushin. Again, we saw in yesterday's daf, again, 2 different explanations for the position of Rabbi Eliezer on a most basic level, using the basic drush of Eliezer paskins, v'yatsa v'haisa li'ish acher. Ultimately, Rabbi Eliezer says, the pasuk says by gerushin, husband will divorce her and she'll be permitted to another man. Rabbi Eliezer's position is, as long as she is permitted to at least one other man, ultimately, again, the gerushin is good. Chachamim disagree. Chachamim say that divorce cannot place any restrictions on the marriage pool of the divorced wife. And if it does, ultimately, again, that is an ineffective divorce. So the Gemara says as follows, it's incredible. After Rabbi Eliezer passed away, 4 elders came to refute his halachic position. Who were they? Eluhain, Rabbi Yosef Lili, Rabbi Tarfon, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, Rabbi Akiva. Supposing that is incredible. After he died, no one started up with Rabbi Eliezer when he was alive, right? But Lamaisa, after he died, they then came in to go ahead and refute his positions. Thank you so much, Rashi. Thank you. So the Gemara says as follows. I'm just going to plug this back in also. So the Gemara says as follows. Now the Gemara is going to go through all 4 of the refutations. Now Rabbi Tarfon. So Rabbi Tarfon said as follows. Va'amar, Hari shahach azuvani says la'achav shalzeh. So we'll say, so remember again, Rabbi Eliezer of the position that halacha l'maisa, if a man says to a woman, Hariat nigureshes, right, or Hariat muteres l'chol adam chutz mi ploni. You are divorced from me and you can marry anyone except for so-and-so. So-and-so. So remember again, Rabbi Eliezer says, it's good gerushin. Come on, Rabbi Tarfon says, let's analyze this. Imagine, we'll say for a moment like this. Reuven is divorcing Rachel and he says to Rachel, you can marry anyone you want except for Shimon. Except for Shimon. Fine. So what happens? Now Rachel goes and she marries Shimon's brother Levi. Good. Now Levi dies without children. And what happens? So the Gemara says, so we'll say, so now Levi dies without children. What's Rachel's status? She's Yivama. Who does she have to do Yibam with? Shimon. Who's Shimon? the man that she is prohibited to marry. So it turns out, says Rabbi Tarfon, that what's going to happen as a result of Ruvain's Tanai, as a result of his condition, he has uprooted a mitzvah min haTorah. He has uprooted the biblical obligation of Yibum, which of course is an impossibility. Halamarata she'en zekrisus. Now we'll say the fact that Ruvain's divorce from Rachel uproots a potential biblical obligation of Yibum later on down the road shows us that what? That this divorce is not a real krisus. Let's remember again, the concept of divorce is davar hakoris beino lebeina. So gerushin divorce is a severance of the marital relationship. If the marriage is not fully severed, then by definition, it's not a divorce. So what Rabbi Tarfon is coming to say is, Rabbi Eliezer, you must be wrong. The ability for a husband to say, you can marry anyone except one guy, essentially leaves them connected in a variety of possible ways. He gives one example of how that could happen, right? So fine, Rachel complies with the directive, doesn't marry Shimon, marries Shimon's brother Levi. Levi dies without children. Rachel now can't go ahead and do Yibum with Shimon, because if she were to do Yibum with Shimon, then what would happen? She would undermine her divorce. What does that show you? That the marital bond between Rachel and Ruvain was never fully severed by the divorce. Next. Now Rabbi Yosef Levi comes along, and he's not means he answers up. He was say Rabbi Eliezer, you're incorrect. Vamar, where did we ever see in the Torah that one person is mutter to someone and asr to someone else? Rather, the Gemara says, ha'asr asr lakol, v'mutter mutter lakol. Either you're prohibited or you're permitted. Right? Either you're prohibited to everyone, mutter to everyone. So therefore, again, halamarata she'in zekrisos. Rabbi Yosef says the fact that Rachel is permitted to everyone else, but can't go ahead and marry Shimon, indicates to us that this is not a proper krisos, not a proper ending of the marriage. Next, by the way, we're going to go through each one of these in greater depth in just a moment. Now, Rabbi Ben Adler said, "V'amar krisos davra karis ben olabina." Both say again, this is more basic contradiction. What is a get? A get is a sefer krisos, a book of division. It is something that fundamentally divides and, more importantly, ends the marital bond between husband and wife. So obviously in this case over here, Ruvain, the husband or the ex-husband, is retaining some hold over his wife by legislating who she can and she can't marry. So the halamarata she'in zekrisos. Now Rabbi Akiva comes along and he says, V'hari, v'amar, hari shaholcha zu v'nisis lechem and. Let's listen to this case. So imagine the following situation, right? Ruvain divorces Rachel. He says to Rachel, you can marry anyone you want except Shimon. Fine. So Rachel goes to marry someone else. She marries Levi. Vayula banim. And now what happens? And now she had children with Levi. Vinis armala onis garsha. And either she's divorced or she's widowed from Levi, her second marriage. Va'amda v'niseis lazan. Then she decides she wants to marry Shimon. So the Gemara says, Shenasra alav lo nimsa get batal b'nai mamzerin. So we say, what would happen then if after Levi dies? Let's say after Levi dies, she decides to marry Shimon. So what happens if she marries Shimon? What happens? Then ultimately, again, she's in violation of the conditions of the get. And then it turns out that what? That retroactively, the children she had with Levi are mamzerim. What do you see? We'll say, first wide line, halamarata she'in zekrisos. And we'll say, they're all pointing to the same idea over here, which says that obviously the fact that Ruvain retains this level of control and can have this level of impact after the divorce has been offered indicates to us that it's not a real krisos, it's not a real division, it's not a real ending of the marriage. Davar acher, and I will say Rabbi Akiva offers up two refutations of the position of Rabbi Eliezer. Davar acher, harisha haya zesh nesar I love Cohen. Imagine for a moment if when Reuven is divorcing Rachel, he says you can marry anyone you want, right? You're permitted to anyone except for Shimon. Now imagine for a moment Shimon is a Cohen. Okay. Umeis hamegarish. And I will say, imagine for a moment now what happens? So Reuven, the husband, dies. He dies. Lo nimtseis amana etzlo, o grusha etzlo koladam. Technically speaking, she would be a grusha vis-a-vis the Kohen, vis-a-vis Shimon, and she would be an almana, a widow, vis-a-vis Shimon, this guy who her husband reported to, ugrusha tzakaladam, but she's a grusha ultimately by everyone else. The kavachomer, and the kavachomer, uma grusha she kala asura b'shil getzad gerish and sheba. So I will say again, the prohibition of grusha, which is a relatively, we'll call it light prohibition, right? More moderate prohibition when it comes to the kahuna. Yet, asura b'shil tzad gerish and sheba. Ultimately, again, she is asura to the kohen because she's a grusha. So, Eishes ish she chamura lokol shekin. Obviously, I will say the prohibition of Eishes ish, which is the prohibition which remains when Reuven says to Rachel, you can marry anyone you want except for Shimon. In this case, Shimon is a kohen, which means that vis-a-vis Shimon, Rachel is still considered to be married. So the Gemara says, Halamarata she'en zekrisos. You see from here, from the fact that there is some residual prohibition of Eishes ish, of married woman, vis-a-vis Shimon, indicates to us what? That halacha l'maisa, it's not a full krisos. So I will say these are the. So okay, we're going to go through all. We're going to go through all four of them again a bit more in depth. But these are the four contradictions that these individuals raised on the position of Rabbi Eliezer. And I will say, bottom line, they all go ahead and they all center on a core concept, which is leaving a provision in a get that says you are muteres to all men except, we're calling him Shimon, is a fundamental lack of krisos, right? Krisos means, again, literally kores, right? It divides, it ends. The whole chap of a get is that it ends the marital bond. Wherein lies the greatest manifestation of the cessation of the marital bond? In that the now divorced woman could marry anyone she wants. If a get doesn't allow for that, then by definition it is missing the core principle of krisos. Now each of them developed this in different ways, but that is their core contradiction, or that is their core problem with the position of Rabbi Eliezer in Mishnah. Good. So we'll say now after everyone kind of said over their contradictions, so we'll say we are now in the wide lines, 1, 2, 3, 4 lines into the wide lines. Amar Rabbi Yeshua, ein mashivin es ha'ari la'achar misa. Rabbi Yeshua says, okay, shkoyach everyone, that's great. You're all saying good. Literally, again, you cannot refute the lion after his death. You can't refute the lion after his death. Now we'll say, now what does this mean? So what's the chap with a lion? So we'll say, this is free advice, right? Don't start up with a lion, right? Why not? If you start up with a lion, chances are he's going to attack back. Rashi says there is something amazing. Rashi says, supposed to listen to this. Rabbi Yeshua essentially is like this. You cannot refute Rabbi Eliezer after his death. Why not? It's not fair. What's not fair? If Rabbi Eliezer was alive, he would have the chance to defend himself. Now that he's dead, you could go ahead and put forward whatever contradictions you want, and he is not here to defend himself. So therefore Rabbi Yeshua says, I hear all of the points. Ein mashivin es ha'ari la'achar misa. You cannot refute the lion after his death. Amar Rava. So Rava said, by the way, Kulu islu pircha lebar mibar lebar midrabalaza ben Azariah. The less le pircha. Rava says, by the way, I just want to tell you, all of the refutations offered themselves could be refuted, except for the position of Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, which we'll discuss. Tayyana, HaChaver Baruch Mordechai supports us. I'm Rabbi Yossi. Roa ani estiv Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah mikulam. Yossi, and remember again, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah was actually the simplest. Remember again, what was his refutation? He was the simplest idea. What was his idea? Sefer Krisos. A get. Again, it's so intuitive. What is a get? A get is something that ends a marriage. He'll say, what is the telltale sign? Right? What's the litmus test as to whether or not the marriage is over? What's the litmus test? Is she permitted to other men? Okay? So if the answer is yes, they're divorced. If the answer is no, they're not divorced. So Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says, Rabbi Eliezer, what are you talking about? if Reuven says to Rachel, his wife, you are divorced, you're permitted to everyone except Shimon, that's not divorced. What is that called? I guess we call it like a really bad fight, right? But Lamaisa, that's not divorced. So therefore, again, Rabbi says all of the other refutations actually themselves can be refuted, except for the position of Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. So let's go. So let's say now we're going to go through all of them again. Amar, Nan Rabbi Tarfon v'Amar. What did Rabbi Tarfon say? Rabbi Tarfon wanted to refute Rabbi Eliezer by saying the following. He was the Zivamar. Hoisha holcha zuvenises la'achav shel zeh shene estralav umeis below banim. So let's say now remember again. What did we have? So Rabbi Tarfon wanted to say like this. Imagine for a moment, Reuven says to Rachel, you're divorced, and you're muteres to any man except Shimon. So fine, Rachel complies. What does she do? She marries Levi, Shimon's brother. What happens? Levi dies without children. Now Rabbi say, it turns out that Rachel has to do what? Rachel has to do yibum. With who? With Shimon, the man to whom she was prohibited. Now obviously she can't. Right? According to Rabbi Elazar, she can't. Rabbi Eliezer, she can't, because if she does so, then she fundamentally negates her get. So it turns out that what? Lodim sazeh oker davar min haTorah. Ultimately, also, what do you see from here? That Reuven, through his condition, has uprooted a biblical obligation. And Rabbi Tarfon sees that like as an untenable approach. Oker, so I'll say again, I wouldn't call that uprooting. Ihu akar, elamasne la'akar davar min haTorah. You're right. Reuven didn't actively uproot anything, but rather he made a condition that resulted in the uprooting of a biblical obligation. Masna, is he making a condition? Mika amarla lo sagilot lo minsa baleila achua tehugavra. So we'll say again, it's not like Reuven told her you have to marry the brother of the guy I prohibited you to. Ella gorem la'akar davar min haTorah. Okay, so we'll say so fine. In other words, what Rabbi Tarfon is really saying is Reuven, through the condition that he imposed on the get, is causing a biblical mitzvah to be uprooted. All right, Ella. So we'll say so now the Gemara. Remember, now we are refuting the refutation of Rabbi Tarfon. Rabbi Tarfon, who says you can't necessarily do something that may result in the uprooting of a mitzvah. After all, Ella me'ata bas achiv lo yisa shem yamus below banim v'nimtza going lakar davar min haTorah. So we'll say, listen to this. So remember, I will say halacha l'maisa. Back to our Yavamas days. A man is allowed to marry his niece. Right? So we'll say, so imagine you have two brothers, Reuven and Shimon, right? And Reuven, Reuven marries Shimon's daughter. Mutter aser. Right? Mutter. Now we'll say, now, isn't a union like that setting you up for the uprooting of a mitzvah of yibum? Because imagine for a moment, Reuven marries Shimon's daughter, right? His brother's daughter, his niece, and now Reuven dies without children. So what happens? Reuven's widow falls to Yibum for Shimon. Only one problem, which is Shimon is her father. So now you have a daughter falling to her father. We actually have this case. Now I'm going to say, so what's the halach? By the way, what's the halach in that case? There's nothing. There's no Yibum. There's no mitzvah. Now both sides, we don't say that such a union is prohibited because it could lead to the uprooting of Yibum. Rather, we recognize that certain permitted marriages ultimately may end up, for whatever the reason, just telling you having no mitzvah. So the Gemara says, so you see, Rabbi Tarfon is wrong. Right? Rabbi Tarfon's whole premise was, Rabbi Eliezer, you must be incorrect, because according to you, there could be a situation where Rachel could be in a marriage that would lead to the uprooting of the mitzvah of Yibum. So what? We allow marriages that ultimately result in the potential uprooting of the mitzvah of Yibum. Next, now, by the way, the Gemara says, according to him, what's the case? We'll say, now this is hearkening back to yesterday's daf. Remember again, we had the machlokes in the Mishnah about what are we talking about? Are we talking about again chutz or almanas? Umemai ilema b'chutz. If you're talking about it's a case of chutz where he said except Mishra Shara Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer holds that chutz works. The Sanya Moda Rabbi Eliezer b'mengarishas ishto va'amrla hari'at mutars l'chol adam chutz miploni. Rabbi Eliezer agrees in a case where a man divorces his wife and he says to you mutars to any man except for so and so. And she goes and she marries someone from the marketplace. Vinis armala onis garsha, and then she's divorced or widowed from that second marriage. Shemuteres lazeh shene'esra alav, that she becomes permitted to the man to whom she was permitted. I will say, we're going to talk about this on the Bais, because this is actually like a fascinating idea that Rabbi Eliezer holds. So let's listen to this. In a case where Reuven says to Rachel, you are permitted to every man, hari'at mutares l'chol adam, chutz miploni, except for Shimon. Rachel complies. She marries Levi. Levi dies or divorces her. After the dissolution of marriage number 2, she can go back and marry Shimon. Now we'll discuss why that is. Ella ba'almanas. Rather, you have to say it's talking about a case of almanas. Fine. Next. Now Rabbi Yosef Elili. So we'll say now we're going to refute the refutation of Rabbi Yosef Elili. What does Rabbi Yosef Elili say? V'amar hecha matzinu asur lazeh u'motor lazeh ha'asur asur lakol v'amuter motor lakol. So we'll say, so this is actually probably the most intriguing of all. And Rabbi Yossi says, I'll tell you why, Rabbi Eliezer, you're wrong. Right? Rabbi Eliezer, remember, what did Rabbi Eliezer say? A man could say to his wife, you are divorced, and you are hereby permitted to every man except for Shimon. Rabbi Yosef Elili says, it doesn't work that way. If you're usher to everyone, and if you're mutter to everyone. Right? There's no usher to this, mutter to this. The Gemara says, really? After all, v'hari truma v'katshim shasru lazeh mutaras lazeh. But that's not true. Life is filled with things that are usher to this one and mutter to this one. Look at truma. Right? Truma is permitted to a Kohen and permitted to everyone else. Kachim, permitted to a Kohen, permitted to everyone else. Tushimura says, 1 second. Be'isr isha kamina. Okay, we're not talking about you. We're talking about, again, when a woman is usher. Either a woman is going to be usher to everyone or mutter to everyone. Is that true? Bahari arayos. What about arayos? So we'll say, right, immoral relationships. In arayos cases, again, I will say, again, if Reuven has a sister, so that woman is prohibited to him, but is permitted to Shimon. So you see, Gemara says, you're right. Be'ishos kaminon. We're talking about, I will say, in marriage. Right? When there is an isser created in marriage, ultimately, again, either a woman is prohibited to everyone or permitted to everyone. There's no quasi-status. To which the Gemara says, Hare eishes ish. That's not true. Look at the case of a married woman. We'll say, a married woman herself is the biggest example of this, right? Why? We'll say, what's that? A married woman? She's permitted to her husband, right? And she's prohibited to everyone else. So it's a perfect example of one woman who is permitted to one person and prohibited. So again, life is filled with these kind of examples. I will say of mutares lazu asur lazu, to which the Gemara says hanu pircha. You're right. That is the very refutation of Rabbi Yosef Elili. Rabbi Yosef Elili, marriage itself represents a status of someone being permitted to one and asura to everyone else. So the Gemara says, Umay, by the way, how does Rabbi Yosef Elili set up the case? If it's a case of almanas, hare hutra etzlo biznos. So I say, technically speaking, almanas only prohibits marriage, doesn't prohibit znos. Ella bechutz. Fine. Now Rabbi Akiva. So I remember again, Rabbi Akiva raised 2 refutations to the position of Rabbi Eliezer. So now Rabbi Akiva va'amar, hare shahal chazu v'niseis la'echa min hashok v'hayu labanim v'nis armala onis garsha. So let's listen to this. Rabbi Akiva said like this. So imagine for a moment, same case. Well, so all the same case. Well, remember, everyone is going on Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer say, Reuven is divorcing his wife Rachel. Hari'at mutaris l'chol adam chutz mi Shimon. Marry anyone you want except Shimon. Fine. Rachel complies. She goes and she marries Levi. All right. V'hayu labanim. She has children with Levi. V'nis amala onis garsha. And now Levi dies, or they divorce. And now Rachel decides to go marry Shimon. She decides to go marry Shimon. We'll say, what happens? Ultimately, we'll say, so what happens then if after being married to Levi, having children with Levi, she decides to go ahead and marry Shimon? It turns out now that she's in violation of the Tanai. Her get is batal, and it turns out that the children she had with Levi are now mamzerim. To which the Gemara says, but 1 second. I'm sorry. So I'll say, so therefore, based on this, Rabbi Akiva wanted to say, you see that it's not krisos. You see the fact that Reuven has such a hold on Rachel Even now, Rabbi says she's in marriage number 3. And halacha l'maaseh, he could dictate, he could impact the status of her children. And her status shows that wasn't a real get. To which the Gemara says, 1 second, Ihachi, bekulu tonight da'alma nabi lo tinsav, domaloma kaimalei t'navinim sa get batal banam amzerim. To which the Gemara said, but remember again, here's the problem. Rabbi Akiva, you can make this argument with any t'nai. Right? They will say, anytime you attach a t'nai ultimately to a get, there's always the fear that non-compliance with t'nai at some time later on could retroactively void the get and could ruin children from an already permitted marriage. To which the Gemara says, Hainu pircha. Ultimately, again, you're right, that is the refutation of Rabbi Akiva. Ubemai, what's the case? Ilema b'chutz, if you're talking about a case of chutz, Mishra Sharab Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer holds that a case of chutz works. The Sanya, Moda Hayi Rabbi Eliezer, Magari Shesishto, Va'amar La Hari At Mutaris L'chol Adam Chutz Miploni. Suppose we just mentioned this before. Rabbi Eliezer agrees in a case that even where he says Hari At Mutaris L'chol Adam Chutz Miploni, and then she goes and she marries someone else, and then she's divorced or widowed from that second marriage, Shemuteres Lazesh Ne'esra Alav, that she is now permitted to go back and marry Shimon, Ella Ba'almanas. Rather, you have to say it's talking about a case of Almanas. Good. And I remember again, Rabbi Akiva himself advanced 2 refutations. The second one was, we'll say 3 lines up from the bottom, Pei Gimel Amud Aleph. Davar Acher, Hare Shahaya Zeh Shene'esra Alav Kohen, Umeis Hamagarish. So we'll say, and I remember again, we're all going to Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer says, remember Reuven says to Rachel, Hari'at mutaras l'chol adam, I'm divorcing you, you are permitted to every man except for Shimon. Shimon is a Kohen. So now what happens? Umeis Hamagarish, and imagine for a moment, Reuven, the man who divorces Rachel, dies. Bonim says, Amona etzlo grusha etzlo kol adam. She is considered to be an Amona vis-a-vis Shimon the Kohen, and a grusha vis-a-vis everyone else. The Kavachomer, Uma grusha shikala asura mishum tzad gerushin sheba. So grusha, which is a relatively light, right, more lenient prohibition by kahuna. Yeah, she is asura to him. So the Gemara says, Eishes ish chamura lo kol shekain. Eishes ish, which is much more chamer, all the more so. Now I will say, now remember again, what Rabbi Akiva essentially was saying was, the fact that there is a residual prohibition of Eishes ish vis-a-vis the Kohen indicates to us that there is not a complete krisos. Ubimai, what's the case? Ilema ba'almanas, if it's a case of almanas, we'll say Amud Beis, so Hari Grusha Etzlo. Hari Grusha Etzlo is Nus, Ella B'chutz. Rather, you have to say ultimately it's talking about a case of Znus. For Rabbi Akiva, I Chutz Sviralei. I'm sorry. Good. Rabbi Akiva, I Chutz Sviralei, Lo Siv Chutz. V'almanas Sviralei, Lo Siv Almanas. Rabbi Akiva, I don't understand. If it's a case of chutz, ultimately answer it up. And if it's a case of almanas, answer it up. To which the Gemara says, Rabbi Akiva, Shmiele di'igad amar chutz, v'igad amar almanas. Rabbi Akiva heard 2 different interpretations about how to set up the case. The Gemara says, So Rabbi Akiva, Shmiele di'igad amar chutz, v'igad amar almanas. Manda amar chutz, hai pircha, umanda amar almanas, hai pircha. And I will say, ultimately, again, there's a pircha, there's a way to refute each of those positions. Umay pircha, I nema iser kahuna shayni, ha Rabbi Eliezer nami me iser kuna kamaisile. So the Gemara says, if you want, what's the pircha? If you want to say that in general, the pircha is that the iser kahuna is just a different kind of iser. So ultimately, again, Rabbi Eliezer also learns out from an iser kahuna. So to which the Gemara says, Rabbi Yanai mishum zaken echad kamasni. Fine. So we'll say, so ultimately. Fine. So we'll say, so therefore again the Gemara just answers up over here that Rabba held like Rabbi Yanai, who taught this case over in the name of a Zakin Echad. So we'll say, let's just bring this together. Now that we kind of have all the 4 refutations. Here's what we have, just to know the structure. Structure is like this, right? Number 1, we have Machlokes in the Mishnah. What's Machlokes in the Mishnah? Man says to a woman, Hari Akmutar Sechol Adam, I'm divorcing you. You are permitted to every man with the exception of Ploni, right? With the exception of Shimon. Shabbosai, is such a get a valid get? Rabbanon, no. Invalid. Rabbi Eliezer, valid. Right? What's Rabbi Eliezer's logic? How can you say such a get is valid? Remember, 2 answers. Let's just go with the second one. The pasuk says, "V'yatsa," pasuk by Gerushin, "V'yatsa b'haisa li'ish acher." She will leave her husband's home and she'll be permitted. She'll go to another man. Rabbi Eliezer says essentially, as long as a get permits her to at least one other man, good to go. Good to go. The Gemara says after Rabbi Eliezer died, 4 sages came in to refute his position. Rabbi Tarfon, Rabbi Yosef Lili, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, Rabbi Kivrite. You're so tempted to say Shahya Mesubin, B'nei Brak, right? But no, different story, right? So ultimately, again, these 4 Rabbanim come in to refute the position of Rabbi Eliezer. Here's what I want to point out. All 4 of the refutations all center on the same basic theme, which is what? It's not krisos. Not krisos. 3 out of the 4 go ahead and illustrate this by bringing up a different case. What the Gemara now proves is that 3 of the 4 refutations themselves could what? Could be refuted. With the exception of Osai one, who was Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. Because Elazar ben Azariah said a pashat refutation. What was his pashat refutation? The Torah calls the get a sefer krisos. This is not a sefer krisos. Right? For an ex-husband to be able to limit who his wife can marry, that's not sefer krisos. And that's why I will say again, Rava said, everyone over here, 3 out of the 4 could be refuted, except Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. Right? He's the only position that cannot be refuted. Good. So I will say that's the end of the sugya. I will tell you, I will say, you know how this comes out, right? In other words, we paskin like Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, in other words, because we paskin like the Chacham in the Mishnah. That's how the Rambam paskins. If a husband goes ahead and says, "This is your get, chutz mi ploni," that is an ineffective get. Now I will say, now here's what's interesting. There's 2 different. I'll just mention this. Actually. Fine. Greg told me to go. Right? So I'll say. So I'll just mention this. So you know how this works. So just halacha l'maisa. We pass like drabanan. So therefore, you cannot stipulate. A man cannot stipulate who his wife can and cannot marry after divorce. And if he does so, that is an ineffective gerushin. Now, the way the Rambam phrases this case is actually something very interesting. The Rambam says it like this. See, we're assuming right now, Osai, that how is this condition being conveyed? How is it being conveyed? Verbally. See, Osai said the good news is, watch this. So imagine Reuven gives Rachel a get. He says, Rachel, this is your get, right? This is your get, Mazel Tov, right? This is your get. And as he's giving it to her, he says, this is your get, right? Hari'at mutares l'chol adam chutz mishimin. And he gives her the get. The Rambam says, ineffective gerushin. The good news is, because this condition is not written in the get, what can he do? She can give it back to him, right? And he could give it again without the Tanai. And giving it again without the Tanai, ultimately again, will make a good gerushin. So that's the good news in this. As opposed to, I'll say, because you could have a version of this where this is written in the get. If it's written in the get, then nothing doing. The get itself becomes invalid and obsolete. Where the condition is verbal, the good news is taking the get back and re-giving it ultimately could result in a valid divorce. All right, let's go weiter. Says there's some great Gemara out of us. So Gemara goes weiter. So Amr Lan Rabbi Yeshua, Ein Mashivin Es Haribach Hamisa. So also Rabbi Yeshua says, now again, Rabbi Yeshua essentially says, guys, great points, all 4 of you, excellent points. You can't refute the lion after he is dead. Yeshua say also, if you think about it, it's such a profound statement. Ein Mashivin Es Haribach Hamisa means, he'll say, sometimes in life, you could be right, but you can't change circumstances. Right? We all face situations like this where I'm correct, but the circumstances are what they are, and they cannot be altered. So for many of us, these are frustrating moments in life because we want to keep espousing our correctkeit. Right? I want to just, but I'm right, but it should be like this. You're right. It should be like this. I'm not debating. You are 100% correct. He'll say, but sometimes circumstances in life are what they are, and they cannot be changed no matter how correct you may be. And I will say, so it's fascinating. Yeshua says, you might be right. You might all be right. Excellent points. You can't refute the line after he's dead. Rabbi Eliezer is not here to defend himself. Were he here, maybe he'd be able to refute your refutations. And therefore, again, we can't overturn his position. Lememra, Rabbi Yeshua Kavase Sirle. Then I will say the way this makes it sound, because Rabbi Yeshua himself holds like Rabbi Eliezer. Is that true? Nami Mifrach Kaparech. But Rabbi Yeshua himself also brought the kasha on the position of Rabbi Eliezer. So what's going on over here? So Rabbi Yeshua is saying to the other Rabbanim, you know what? I just want to tell you, I also have a pircha. I also have a kasha on the position of Rabbi Eliezer. Mihu bein ledidi bein ledidachu ima shivan es harilach hamisa. Rabbi Yeshua says, listen, guys, I'm with you. I also have a refutation of the position of Rabbi Eliezer, but both for you and for me, again, in Mashivan Asari Lachanisa, you can't go ahead and refute the lion after his death. Umay Pircha Rabbi Yeshua. By the way, what is Rabbi Yeshua's refutation? That's very interesting. The Sanya of Rabbi Yeshua, Makish Kol Mihavia Shnia, the Kol Mihavia Rishona. So let's listen to this. Rabbi Yeshua equates, I will say, her status before her first marriage to her status before her second marriage. How so? So they both say, because remember again, the pasuk itself says, Ki yikach ish isha, right? And then it says, V'haisa li ish acher. So we'll say, so ultimately again, the Torah itself equates her status prior to her first marriage with her status prior to her second marriage. Now watch this. The Gemara says, so Makish kol mehavia kishnia kol mehavia rishona. Ma kol mehavia rishona de lo agida be'inish achrina. Just like before she gets married, she is not tethered to any other man. Av kol mehavia shnia de lo agida be'inish achrina. So too again, before her second marriage, ultimately again, she cannot be tethered to any other man. And therefore, alocha l'maisa, if Reuven divorces her and he says to her, this is your get, and you are mutaras l'chol adam chutz mishimin, what's effectively happening? She is tethered to her husband Reuven. So therefore, again, the Gemara says Rabbi Yeshua himself also had a kasha on Rabbi Eliezer, but nevertheless, he told everyone, in mashivin es hari la'achamisa, you cannot go ahead and refute the lion after he is dead. Incredible. Now the Gemara is going to go back and examine a statement that we mentioned before, which is quite interesting. So Gufa, Moda Rabbi Eliezer b'megarish ishto, v'amar la hari akim taras l'chol adam chutz mi ploni, v'holcha v'nises la'echa min ashuk, v'nis armula onis garsha, shemuteres lazeh shene'esra alav. So, let's remember again, the Gemara said before, and this is actually quite fascinating, that apparently Rabbi Eliezer agrees in the following case. Watch this. Reuven says to Rachel, right, we're divorced, here's your get. Hari akmu taras l'chol adam, chutz mi ploni. You are right, you are mutaris to anyone except for Shimon, as Reuben says to Rachel. So fine. So what happens? So now Rachel goes and she marries Shimon. Totally someone unrelated. What happens? Shimon dies. Now after the death of Shimon, after again the dissolution of now her second marriage, so even Rabbi Eliezer agrees that Rachel could go back and marry Shimon. Fascinating, right? Shimon was the guy, remember again, who was the Tanai. He was part of the Tanai. So now after the dissolution of her marriage to Levi, now she can go and she can marry Shimon. Okay, so what's the pshat? What is the pshat? Fine, okay, we'll catch good. So the word says, Heishiv Rabbi Shimon Elazar, Tshuva there, so I'm sorry, Heishiv Rabbi Elazar, Heishiv Rabbi Shimon Bar Elazar, Tshuva l'divrei Rabbi Eliezer, Hecha matzinu shezeh oser v'zeh matir. So we'll say, so what does this mean, right? Where do we ever see a case? So we'll say, so essentially what's happening over here? So Reuven is prohibiting Rachel from marrying Shimon, and now her marriage to Levi is permitting her, so to speak, to marry Shimon. So comes along Rabbi Shimon Elazar and says, I don't understand. Where do we ever find the case of where one person answers something and another person could be matir it? Right? I will say, isn't that effectively what's happening over here? Right? Reuben is saying to Rachel, you cannot marry Shimon. She marries Levi, and through her marriage to Levi, she's becoming permitted to marry Shimon. Where do we ever see a concept like that? That one person asers something and another person comes along and maters it. Is that below? We don't see that. Mahari Yivama. What about the case of Yivama? The Baal Asa Oser, the Yavam Matir. Let's say, isn't this a case of Yibum? Right? A husband dies, she is prohibited to marry anyone. Right, except Yavam. And now, also ultimately again, either after Yibum or Chalitza, let's say Chalitza, right? Ultimately, and what happens? She's permitted to everyone. So you see a case of one person removing an Isser created by someone else. Hasam Yavam Huka Asrala. That's not true. It's not the husband who's prohibiting her, it's the Yavam. Di'imi Baal Ha Sharia V'kaima. Because remember again, it's only the existence of the Yavam that prohibits the Yavama, right? If a husband dies and there is no surviving brother, then what? We'll say, what's her status? She's permitted to anyone. It's only the existence of the Yavam that prohibits her. So therefore, the same Yavam that prohibits her is also the same Yavam that permits her. What about the case? The Gemara says, Hari Nidarim. What about Nidarim? The Noder Oser, the Chacham Matir. I will say, listen to this. Right? A person takes a neder. Right? Background, a person takes a neder. So I'll say, what can you can go to the Chacham for Ataras Nedarim. So here, again, I made the neder. And what I will say, who permits the neder? Who permits it? The Chacham. So here you see a case of one person creating Isser, another person lifting it. Rabbi Yochanan, Ein Chacham Matir Klum Ela Becharata. That's not true. But remember again, what does a Chacham do? A Chacham helps you find. Chacham is like a therapist. Right? You will say, so right, a good therapist doesn't tell you what to do. What does a good therapist do? A good therapist helps you find answers that are within you. What does a Chacham do? A Chacham doesn't really permit anything for you, although it's not really true, a Chacham can. But Moishe again, a Chacham often helps you find the charata within yourself. What does the Chacham do? Chacham says, tell me, you made the neder not to eat meat. How'd you realize that this was going to impact your Shabbos Su'udah? Would you have ever made this neder? And I say, of course not. That's charata. So ultimately, it's not the Chacham ultimately going ahead and being matter the neder. Rather, it's the Chacham helping me finding the charata. Hari hafaras habal, the Isha. Well, so what about the fact that a husband has the ability to annul his wife's nedarim? The Isha nedaris vabal meifar. So I will say, so again, that's a pretty clear case of one person creating Isser, another person negating it. The Gemara says, Hasam kidra pinchas u'shnei derabah. Torah pinchas u'shnei derabah. So we'll say it's different. Kol noderes al das bailehi noderes. It's different. But so whenever a woman makes a neder, she always makes a neder based on what they will say. A woman knows that her husband has ultimate revocation power. So whenever a woman makes a neder, she always makes a neder with the understanding of, if my husband wants this, then it'll work. If my husband doesn't want it, it won't work. So therefore, halacha l'maisa is considered to be that she's making it al das her husband. Well, see, I'll just mention to you the statement of Rabbi Yochanan caught me very much as I was looking at the daf last night. Rabbi Yochanan says, "In chacham matir klum ela becharata." So I'll say maybe it's because we're almost on the cusp of Chodesh Elul. It's actually scary to say it. No, it's hard to imagine. That really in just a week from this Thursday night, this Rosh Chodesh Elul, it's incredible. So I think that there's a powerful message in those words. Ein chacham matir klum. See, I will say at the end of the day, that a chacham wants to be matir himself. Right? Every person wants to be matir. Right? I want to be matir. I want to give myself a heter for a second chance. So what do all of us want out of life? Second chance, 27th chance, 5,721st chance, right? I just always want another chance. So I will say, interestingly enough, what Rabbi Yochanan is saying is like this. So, what do you need in order to have your second chances, or your third or fourth, whatever number I'm up to? Ein chacham matir klum. You cannot be matir, you cannot permit yourself a second chance unless, of course, you're willing to start Ella Bicharata. Unless, of course, you're willing to undergo the process of remorse. See, I will say, second chances just require one simple thing to get started. Remorse for what has or hasn't happened up until this point in time. And remorse is very difficult, because often what many of us want is the ability to have a second chance without having to face the past in any way. And that you can't do. You want a fresh start? You can have as many fresh starts as you want, as long as you're willing to acknowledge that what happened before is not the right way to live my life. And if I'm willing to engage in that type of life honesty, if I'm willing to engage in that charata, and to say, okay, you know what, that didn't work, that wasn't good, then ultimately, again, you could have the new chance. Failure to face the past prevents me from new beginnings. And I think that's what's embedded in the words. Rabbi Yochanan says, a chacham understands, ein chacham matir klum. A chacham cannot permit himself the beauty of a new beginning, ela becharata. Unless, of course, he's willing to be brave enough to have remorse for what was. Acknowledge that the way I've done things has not worked up until this point, and that brave acknowledgement opens the door to new beginnings. We'll have to stop over here for today. Shkoyach.